Alright everyone, happy Halloween. If you're new to this channel, I've made this kind of weird habit of making videos around Halloween where I overanalyze some aspect of Judeo-Christian demonology. So far, I've done one for Satan and another one for Lilith, and now, I thought it was a good time to do one on the Seal of Solomon. You've probably heard about Solomon from the Bible, but there's a whole lot of apocrypha around this guy that has shrouded him in myth. Legends of him being able to summon and control demons, or using demons to build the temple, or trapping all the genies out there that are sealed away in bottles and lamps have been circulating for about a couple of millennia now. Sorting through all of this stuff and figuring out where each myth came from is a bit of a mess. Now, in the Bible, Solomon is a bit of a weird character. He supposedly received supernatural wisdom from God, but he ends up breaking the commandment in Deuteronomy 17 verse 17, which says kings should not have more than one wife, or they'll turn the king away from God. And this was after King David had his own Game of Thrones shenanigans as a result of his inability to control his own lust. So, how wise was Solomon exactly? Well, there's a lot of different interpretations on the word wisdom, and I mean that literally, as people don't always agree on the ancient Hebrew scripture. In some versions, Solomon asked God specifically for the ability to know good from evil, so that he may better rule over Israel. In other versions, it's a more broadly defined wisdom. And in some stories, Solomon expressly brings up the fact that he is inexperienced, so wisdom more to do with that? Another translation is that he received Chokmat Elohim. I'm not pronouncing that with enough phlegm, but it means divine wisdom. Exactly what that means is up for grabs. It could literally just mean any of the other types of wisdom that I just mentioned, but it came from God, or it could mean some kind of supernatural wisdom. It could even mean knowledge of the supernatural. A few people have suggested that Solomon was granted this wisdom by God on the condition that he walk in the path of righteousness. In other words, he gets to have supernatural wisdom, but only as long as he's following Big G. These stories tend to relate Solomon's wisdom with the strength of Samson, a supernatural power that was also conditional on following certain rules. But there's nothing like that described in the Bible, at least not regarding Solomon. The conditional wisdom thing appears to just be made up. Now, in the Catholic Church during the Renaissance, there were a lot of attempts at overlapping Solomon's wisdom with the story of Faust. We've talked about Faust before, mostly about the demon Mephistopheles who offers you a deal. But I don't think I ever brought up what Faust got out of the deal before. In most stories, he bargains with Mephistopheles for supernatural knowledge, which he then uses for pleasure, mostly hedonistic pleasure. The Catholic Church once took the stance that Solomon might have done something similar. So, there's this weird duality regarding Solomon. On the one hand, he's supposed to be the wisest king in Israel's history, maybe even the wisest king in all of history. He's supposedly the author of the books of Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. But he also completely ignored the commandment to not take more than one wife, because multiple wives will turn him away from God. According to the scripture, he had over 300 wives and 900 concubines. And his story in the Bible doesn't overlook the fact that this was a sin, and that it ended up bringing the kingdom of Israel crashing down around him even after his death. Solomon is simultaneously the poster child of the stereotypical good and wise king, and also the textbook example of a wicked king of Israel, the likes of which the prophets would condemn for most of the books of the major prophets, and some of the minor ones. And the fact of the matter is that the Bible doesn't really explain how this happened. Now, realistically, it's unlikely that Solomon authored all of the books that we're told, as the 3 books associated with him are more like compilations than actual books, all of which were put to paper centuries after his lifetime. He probably contributed to them, but it's unlikely that he actually wrote them all. In fact, every detail we have about Solomon wasn't put down in writing until the Second Temple period, which raises questions about their accuracy. Lots of the stuff we'll be going over came from much later, but nothing seems to have been recorded during the guy's lifetime. Now, Solomon's father, King David, first gets brought into the palace when King Saul is having fits of madness that only David seems to be able to calm through his music. And people back then didn't really consider there to be a difference between madness and demonic possession, so there were a few schools of thought that would eventually portray David as an early type of exorcist, with some of these details even being recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a psalm in a page that is frustratingly missing entire pieces which included, from what we can tell, some form of exorcism rite, which included the phrase, Me'ata, which roughly translates to, "Who are you?" Now, what is meant by this phrase can be interpreted many ways, especially when we have less than half of a rolled-up piece of parchment to work with. Maybe it's calling to the person possessed by the demon and asking them to remember their name. Maybe it's forcing the demon to recognize that the body they're in doesn't belong to them. But in the most common interpretation, it is demanding the name of the demon, threatening them with punishments if they do not comply, and then using the demon's name to force them out of the person. This rite of exorcism is also included in what is called Solomonic magic, because there's a bizarre amount of similar rites ascribed to Solomon, most of which seem to have been first put into writing in the Byzantine era, which really raises some questions about their legitimacy. Solomonic magic, as its name suggests, is a variety of rituals and spells allegedly written by Solomon himself, possibly as a product of being given divine knowledge from God. Notably, Solomonic magic predates Kabbalah by over 1,000 years. So, these are not considered evil spells, at least at this time, because they came from Big G, and they were used to defeat demons, not for anything nefarious. I'm sure the fact that Christianity has never been good about distinguishing magic that comes from God and magic that comes from demons won't come up later in this video. Now the phrase, son of David, becomes highly associated with exorcism around the turn of the Common Era, and the fact that this would refer literally to Solomon gets juxtaposed with the fact that Jesus was also supposed to be descended from David. And as we all know, Jesus was well known for driving out demons. Some people even compare the two, marking Jesus as a superior version of both Solomon and David. But even before Jesus' time, rabbis would try to use these exorcism rites long after Solomon's lifetime, as the primary means for releasing a person from demonic possession. However, it's not that much of a leap in logic to think that if you can force a demon to leave a body by threatening them with their true name, then you can also command them to do other things. So, Solomon starts out as a king who has supernatural wisdom. He gets promoted at some point to exorcist, and later the author of many exorcism rites. And now, he starts to be reimagined as some kind of sorcerer who can bind demons and make them follow his orders. And his status as a sorcerer who could control and exorcise demons was well known, and widely praised, even by people who weren't Jewish. Solomonic amulets, usually depicting him riding a horse and spearing some kind of demon, often thought to be Lilith, have been found all over the ancient world, even in places where Judaism wasn't particularly popular, suggesting that Solomon the Exorcist was recognized all over the ancient world. There is a Talmudic legend, which states that while Solomon was building the temple, he ran into a conundrum in Jewish law. Specifically, it said that the altar, and by extension the temple itself, had to be made from unhewn stone, meaning it could not be cut with iron tools. In this legend, Solomon has to get a magical worm called a shamir, which can shape the stone for you, but only Asmodeus, the king of demons, knows where that is. Remember Asmodeus? This guy shows up in a lot of these types of videos. So, Solomon basically has to do that voodoo that he does so well into getting Asmodeus into revealing where he can find his magical masonry worm. Now, in some versions, Asmodeus then turns the tables on Solomon and manages to disguise himself as the king of Israel and take the throne for himself, and Solomon either has to get the throne back, or he doesn't. They don't all end with him reclaiming the throne. And the ones where the demon king gets control of Israel and pretends to be Solomon for the remainder of his reign are sometimes used to explain why he had so many wives and concubines, and why he allowed them to set up idols to pagan gods in the temple. It almost makes sense, if you don't think about it too much. Even in his earliest conception, Asmodeus is associated in particular with the deadly sin of lust, so having loads of women like this kind of tracks. You just have to ignore the part where God punishes Solomon for these actions, along with Israel itself, when Big G should be aware that a demon is responsible. Now in the 7th century, legends of Solomon's power over demons had made their way into Arabia, where the Quran actually includes details about the guy having power over the wind, some animals, and especially the jinn. The Quran is even more explicit than most of the texts I've mentioned that Solomon's power expressly came from Big G, and that Solomon himself never practiced any kind of magic taught by demons. In fact, Islamic texts almost seem to treat the subject like they're making a disclaimer, as if they're trying to refute the myth that Solomon had demon magic that had gotten popular at the time, and they needed to address it. You'll notice that in all of the Abrahamic religions at this time, even the ones that start to suggest that he had magical power over demons, they all still agree that any power Solomon had is coming from God, and he's still one of the good guys. As to Solomon's ring, there are mentions of people using magic rings throughout history, and they do seem to be heavily inspired by the Ring of Solomon, with the Ring of Gyges, of course, being the other major inspiration. For example, there's an account of a Roman guy named Vespasian who allegedly was able to exorcise demons, in public, mind you, using the power of a magic ring and Solomonic magic, although there's nothing to suggest the ring in question belonged to Solomon. But the earliest description of Solomon's ring actually comes from a text called the Testament of Solomon, which was finally published sometime in the Middle Ages, although it seems like multiple authors were working on it for some time. In this text, Solomon prays to God for the power to drive out a demon named Orneus, who's harassing a young man, and the archangel Michael comes down and gives him a magical ring. The ring is very clearly described as a signet ring, bearing a seal that Solomon is then able to use to bind demons. Either the ring in question carries with it the authority of the archangel Michael, or even from Big G himself. And here, the actual magic of the ring is really just the authority granted to Solomon by either God or the angels. It's not even Solomon's ring, realistically. It's more like a bureaucratic tool than anything else. Which is, of course, way too boring for the likes of demonologists. So, stories start to be woven about how the ring itself had some kind of actual magical powers, and that the seal was a magical symbol. Since signet rings were often round enough to be nearly circular, it's easy to imagine all kinds of magical circles being etched in there. And they're always perfect circles, too. Ever notice that? Like, we can sometimes get a computer to machine tool a particular symbol into a perfect circle on a good day in the modern era, and somehow perfect magic circles in fiction are done by hand. Although, maybe that adds to the esoteric nature of a magic circle. The idea might be that only a particularly skilled artisan, or maybe even an actual wizard, can draw it. That might explain why not everyone who knows what the magic circle looks like can make it work. Now, we actually have a few surviving examples of ancient Israeli signet rings, particularly the ring of King Hezekiah, and you'll notice it doesn't look anything like a pentagram or a six-pointed star. That'll come later. It actually does look like the kind of signet ring that people could have crafted back then with the tools available. Now, according to one legend, the Ring of Solomon could be venerated in a chapel, nearby the Holy Sepulchre. In this chapel, there are said to be 12 basins, made of silver, sitting atop marble columns. These basins are said to be where Solomon bound up the demons when they weren't being used to build the temple, and each one supposedly had Solomon's seal pressed into the basins. In these stories, the ring is said to be made of electrum, an alloy of silver and gold, and according to an Egyptian alchemist named Zosimos of Panopolis, who seemed to be the primary source of this legend, Solomon also had 7 electrum vessels, each bearing inscriptions that bound demons within. Further, Zosimos added that these vessels were stored underground, in an abyss under Jerusalem. There's a long-standing myth in Jewish lore that Jerusalem is supposed to be a cap of sorts over the underworld, and the idea that you store your demon jugs down there actually would have made sense. Of course, Zosimos is said to have lived around 300 AD, more than a few centuries after Solomon's time, so take that guy's account with a grain of salt. How he came by this legend is anyone's guess. Now, for some reason, Islam gets really obsessed with Solomon's ring. Unlike with Christianity or Judaism, by the time Islam is founded, myths surrounding Solomon's ring are everywhere. While not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, at least one legend mentions Solomon losing the ring after it's stolen by a demon, who then uses it to impersonate the king of Jerusalem. It's similar to the other story where Asmodeus usurps Solomon's throne, and again, it seems that this myth is sometimes used to explain why Solomon took so many wives when Deuteronomy told the kings of Israel not to do that. Not a lot of details about the ring are told, but later in the Islamic tales of various prophets, the ring is reaffirmed to be a signet ring, now made of the purest silver instead of electrum, and bearing a seal made of sapphire. This version even adds that the magical inscription on the ring's 4 sides can control shaitans, animals, kings, and even plants, mountains, and the sea. Shaitans can be interpreted as both demons and jinn. The line between the two isn't always clear. Sometimes they literally are the same thing, depending on the legend. Benevolent jinn do exist in Islam, but it's left up to the imagination if Solomon was enslaving good jinn along with the bad. Also, if you haven't guessed already, Solomon sealing demons and jinn and controlling them with his ring appears to be the primary source of the legends regarding genies in bottles or lamps. Now, among other things, this ring in Islamic stories appears to also give him the power to speak to animals, and eventually, we start to get a really important piece of the myth, that Solomon's ring could tell him anything he wished to know. Considering that Solomon is already known for having supernatural wisdom, one could interpret this to mean that he asks his ring for wisdom on demand. Maybe the ring literally gives him a walkie-talkie of sorts that he can use to speak directly to God when he needs advice or information. This certainly isn't biblical, but it would explain the whole 300 wives and 900 concubines thing. Maybe he just didn't feel like asking God if that was a good idea ahead of time. Now, we still have no idea what's supposed to be on the seal of Solomon's ring itself. Turns out, there are some manuscripts out there that do, in fact, describe the seal itself. But not a single one of them agrees with another. A few of them do feature a pentagram and various words of power. Never the same words of power, but what are you going to do? Some of this could be the results of people trying to recreate the ring's seal, and when it doesn't turn out to have any magical powers, they probably thought, well, we just didn't get the seal right, and then went back to the drawing board. The material of the ring gets mixed up a lot too. Sometimes it's gold, sometimes it's electrum or silver, and sometimes it's brass. For the signet seal, a pentagram became popular for a while, and while the six-pointed star does show up from time to time, it's shockingly rare compared to how much the so-called Star of David is associated with Israel now. The wider acceptance of the six-pointed star among Judaism is actually more recent, seemingly starting in Prague, oddly enough. What's weirder about all of this is that the six-pointed star is associated with the shield of David, and didn't show up in any Solomonic magic. The pentagram, on the other hand, shows up in a lot of Indo-European magic, and is even older, showing up in various types of astrology and even necromancy. And by necromancy, I mean pretending to call up the dead like a spirit medium so you can scam their relatives out of money, not raising an undead army. But the association of the pentagram with forbidden and evil magic may have had a role in Christianity later trying to distance itself from Solomon. Removing Solomon and his place in building the temple isn't really something you can do if you want to keep the rest of the Old Testament in any kind of order. And the church has a bit of a massive problem by the Middle Ages, where they've come to assume any and all magic, regardless of its source, is automatically evil. A seal that can bind demons? Must be the work of the devil. A rabbi brings a man-shaped lump of clay to life to protect the Jewish commune? Must be demon magic. A guy makes some kind of pressure measuring device called a barometer that can predict when a storm is coming? Definitely witchcraft. The problem here comes from the fact that Christians tend to read verses like, "Suffer not a witch to live," and then apply more recent definitions to things like witch to mean anyone who practices magic, without really defining what magic is, because it isn't defined in the Bible. In Exodus, a witch was someone who killed babies and used their entrails to predict the future. That'd get you the death penalty today. Sorcery referred to using hallucinogens to take advantage of people while they were drugged against their will. The rest of the types of magic makers described in the Bible were just frauds swindling people out of their money. There is nothing in the Bible to suggest that the deal with the devil brand of witchcraft is supported by Scripture, but that's what a lot of Christians believe. And thanks to millennia of oversimplification, they extend this to believe that all magic comes from demons, even if it's explicitly being used to drive them out or is being ordained by God. Judaism has approached this problem from a different angle. On the one hand, anything that can be used as ammunition for anti-Semitism has often been brushed under the rug. And on the other hand, a lot of magic that isn't expressly evil has been associated in one form or another with one of the deadly sins. Creating a golem has been connected to pride. Check out my previous video on that for more details. And the idea that too much esoteric knowledge or power can corrupt you does seem to intertwine with the stories of Solomon in one way or another. After all, either Solomon lost control over his powers and a demon took his place, or he really did take 300 wives and 900 concubines after God told him not to. There's no version of his story that ends well. This has led to a problem with Judeo-Christianity that I promised to do a video on another day, where both religions have an issue in which they reject fantasy, or view fantasy as sinful to some degree. Judaism is a bit better at resisting this, but they're not immune. And it shows, because the result of being anti-fantasy is that people turn to the Bible for an outlet. As Terry Pratchett once said, humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the rising ape meets the falling angel. And if we can't get that need met by imagining our own fantastical worlds because we're getting chastised by priests and rabbis, then we're going to try and meet that need by injecting fantasy into Scripture where it doesn't really belong. And I think this has played a role in turning Solomon from the Bible into some kind of sorcerer who could control demons with a magic seal. I think that some people put these myths together from outside of Judeo-Christianity in the same way that Arthurian legends involving the Holy Grail weren't supposed to be part of Christian doctrine, but somewhere along the way, people started taking them seriously. Solomonic magic, and the exorcism rites therein, probably had to come about for Judaism to wrestle with the fact that evil spirits are part of their religion. And having some way of fighting those spirits is a must in order for people to sleep soundly at night. You can't live without that, especially when any form of madness or mental disorder is going to look like demons to the average person. And with the aforementioned ban on fantasy that both religions have fallen prey to in the past, people often turn to the Bible for stories that scratch that itch, even if they have to cram things in there that were never part of Scripture. And as people increasingly start to see magic as evil, regardless of the source, you end up repainting Solomon as some kind of evil sorcerer who used unholy magic to control an army of demons. And with that, let's talk about today's featured game. The Midnight Exorcist is something of a puzzle horror game in which you must investigate a museum at night. A person has died in the museum recently, and someone working there thinks the whole scene smelled of ghosts or something. So they called you, a paranormal investigator who supposedly knows how to deal with these sorts of things. The story kind of falls apart after that. I mean, as soon as stone tablets start lighting up and hurling themselves at you, I think it's safe to say that something supernatural is indeed going on. You have the ability to attack enemies in puzzles by flinging coins at them. Whether these are special, magical coins or just whatever you swipe from the tip jar at the front desk is anyone's guess, but it kind of moves the game into more of a Silent Hill type of horror. You're not helpless, you're just not unstoppable. The boss fight in the demo seemed like it'd be a difficult challenge, but then I discovered I didn't have to follow the mummy's puzzle shenanigans and could just fling the coins directly at him, and then the fight became super easy. I'll give the Midnight Exorcist credit for its handling of spooky ambiance, but I'm not sure what else to make of it. Maybe my horror standards are just too high. I could definitely see someone streaming this game on YouTube for spooky content when the full game comes out. That was a hint, in case there are any streamers listening to this. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I am pleased to announce that Heroes of Jinan, The Science of Magic is now available on audiobook. Perfect for those of you who have to commute a lot to work and can't read and drive at the same time. And if you prefer paperback, you can still get all of my books on Amazon. Link in the description below. Alright, that's all for today. Happy Halloween, everyone, and thank you all, and goodbye.